Okay, 1 Samuel 18. This is taking place right after David has defeated Goliath. We talked last week about how it was such an amazing victory for this young shepherd boy, not dressed as you would expect a warrior to be dressed like a shepherd boy, in fact. And he went into the battle with only 5 stones and his sling, and was able to plant that rock right into Goliath's head. Goliath fell down, and I saw something after I left that I hadn't seen when I was even here teaching you. It said that after David had brought him down, it said that he went up to him and he took his sword and killed him and then cut his head off. And I think what I might have said last week had to do with just, he had knocked him down, he took the sword and just cut his head off. But I think he found the chinks in the armor and he finished his life and then he cut his head off. And this is kind of gruesome, but it's what happened. And so after, there was a huge battle that followed, because the whole army of the Philistines had come out against Israel. And so when they were defeated, they were wiping out Philistines all the way to their hometowns. And it was a massive, massive victory. And so as they're coming back, David had been involved. He'd been involved in the battle. And as they're coming back, David is still holding on to the head of Goliath. It was a trophy. And he was a young man. I'm not really sure, I think I mentioned this to you last week, not really sure how old David was. Some people say he was 15, around that age. Some people say he was as old as 25. I kind of lean toward, for several reasons, and I'll share some of them with you tonight. I lean toward the earlier age of around 15. And so at any rate, his brother, remember what his brother Eliab had said? "What are you doing down here? You conceited little thing, you. Who'd you leave your few sheep with? I know you. You just came down to get a piece of the action. You just wanted to see what's going on. Look what I got, brother. I got Goliath's head here." He's carrying it. He walks up, and so they bring him up to King Saul. And so that's where we come right here, chapter 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. Now, you'll remember that in some previous chapters, David had been selected as a musician to come into the household of Saul and to play music that would calm Saul down. Because when the Spirit of God had been on Saul, anointing him for the kingship, and when the Spirit of God left him, the Spirit of God had then anointed David. And so that what do you call it, vacuum in Saul had allowed evil to come in, and it was causing him to be very upset. So David had come in, he'd play for him, and then it's possible that may have passed. Saul wasn't so super paranoid and jealous at that point, didn't have anybody to be super paranoid and jealous about. But I dare say that having heard the words of Samuel some years before, that the kingdom was being taken away from him, that his dynasty would not continue, Saul had probably been scanning the horizon of Israel, listening for every note of praise of anybody that might be his successor. He hadn't found anybody up to this point. And so he may have gone through this little phase, and then David may have gone back home. And if you know anything about important men, they quite often are served by people that they don't know much about. Can you imagine a senator? Let's say one of our senators. And he's got some kids that are working there in the Congress, and they're helping him out, bringing him notes. Do you think he knows the name and the parentage of every kid that helps out there in the Senate? Probably not. And so, when something's going to happen here, and you're going to be like, where'd that come from? Well, actually, it was the end of the last chapter when Abner says, Saul says, "Who is this kid?" And Abner says, "I don't know." Well, Abner wouldn't have had any occasion to have known. And it's possible that there had been a couple of years intervened, and as I mentioned last week, David may have grown up a little bit. He may have been only 10 or 12 when he was anointed, and now he's a 15-plus young man. And so Saul may not have recognized him, or he may have just not known, because he was the king, and he had a lot of things on his plate. So at any rate, now he's been talking to Saul. He has the head of Goliath still in his hand. And as David was sharing why he did it, how he was able to accomplish it, Jonathan heard some stuff that reminded him of himself. You remember a number of years before this, we had talked about how 2 different times Jonathan had gone out and had attacked the enemy while Dad was sitting under the tree, relaxing. Dad was a reactionary kind of a guy. Jonathan was a proactive kind of a guy, and he says to himself, you know what? God can save by many, He can save by few. Let's go. And he had the faith to believe, and God honored that faith. And so as he sees David now, he's like, wow, he feels like I do. He believes in God like I believe in God, and these guys connected. Now, one of the things that's important for us to notice here is, and I've mentioned this to you before, and I was surprised that even some of the commentators didn't pick up on this. Some of them did, some of the more recent ones. But some of them were saying, well, now, these 2 young men, it's the same, they're both young warriors, and they're both about the same age. And no, they're not. They're not. If you remember, way back at the beginning of Saul's reign, it said that 2 years in, Jonathan was leading a group of 1,000 men. Now, you don't let a little 2-year-old or a 5-year-old lead 1,000 men. You might let a 15-year-old. And that seems to be the general opinion, that he was somewhere around 15 years old when his dad was the early years of his dad's kingship. Anyway, boiling it all down, that would make Jonathan some 20 to 30 years older than David. How many people do you know who have best friends that are 30 years older than they are? Sometimes I think we allow our conception of age and age distinctions to make us miss out on some really good connections. We'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the things I wanted to bring up and touch on again is, why did Jonathan not attack Goliath? And there's some important stuff here. Some speculation, but then the application is not speculation, okay? I think that possibly Jonathan didn't attack Goliath because God didn't tell him to. Does that make sense? God had something else planned. He had a plan for this young man named David to come onto the national scene by taking out the big guy Goliath. And he didn't plan for Jonathan to do that, because Jonathan was already in a position of recognition. He was already the prince. He was the oldest son of the king. He already had all this recognition, and he wasn't going to be king. Samuel had already said that. Your family will not continue as king. Your dynasty is not going to continue. I think another thing is that Jonathan seems to be a behind-the-scenes kind of a guy. Do you remember back in those other stories that I read to you about Michmash? And it said nobody knew he had gone. He had told no one that he had gone. Why? Because I think it was just Jonathan's personality that he would prefer to be behind the scenes. And there are some people that are like that. Some people do not want to be in the spotlight. They would cringe at the thought of having to stand here on a Sunday morning and address a crowd like we had last Sunday. Which was, by the way, a pretty good crowd, don't you think? Whenever you have a trouble finding seats, that's a good thing. You may not get to sit in your particular pew, but that's okay. Somebody else can have your pew for that day. But some people just, they would much rather just do something behind the scenes. I think Jonathan was that kind of a guy. And then I think it's possible also that Jonathan may not have had the necessary skills. David did. So with all that said, here's some lessons. Number one would be that God guides us individually, and what he expects of one person is not what he expects of another person. Now, there are some things that he expects of all of us. He expects righteousness and godliness and holiness. He expects us to trust in him as our Savior through faith. But when it comes to what he wants us to do in this world, he's not going to ask Mike to do he would not ask me to do what he asked Mike to do. Because I'll tell you why. Because it would take me 10 times longer to do it than it does Mike. Because Mike's got skills that I don't have. Okay? And so God's going to require of you, and that's another thing. He's not going to come to you and say, okay, he's not going to come to me and tell me that I need to go and fix James's transmission. Because it wouldn't happen. I probably told you about it. I had this neighbor a number of years ago. He was a good mechanic. He was a race car mechanic. Lived right across the street from me, and I was in my garage, and I was working on my brakes, and you would have enjoyed. You'd have got a laugh out of this. It takes me so long it took me like 6 hours to do the rear brakes on my van. And this guy comes over, and I thought, oh, he's coming over. He's going to offer to help. He comes over. He's this big, husky guy. He says, Barry, he says, you know, it's a good thing you don't do piecework for a living. You'd starve to death. So God's going to give you a job to do that's suited to your gifts and your talents and your abilities. And he's going to respect your personality because guess what? He gave it to you. He made you like you are. And so I think even though we don't know for sure why brave and faithful Jonathan didn't take on Goliath, I think as we speculate, we can see some really good lessons there. Now, one of the things that happens here, though, is kind of puzzling. Because it says Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing, and he gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. What? This young man has just walked up. He's explained he's just won his great battle, took out the giant, and he's been out there fighting in the battle. And now he walks up, and the king's son takes off his royal robe and puts it on this kid's shoulders. He takes off his sword, his belt, his bow, his tunic. Why in the world did he do that? A couple of reasons. Number one, who remembers how David was dressed when he attacked Goliath? What was he dressed like? He was dressed like a shepherd, okay? Saul tried to put his royal armor and stuff on him. David said, I can't handle this. I can't do it. I'm not used to it. And so he took it all off. He went out as a shepherd. Shepherds were of a lower class. He was the youngest. That's why he ended up doing the shepherding work. And so they didn't dress like royalty dressed. And now there's been such a tremendous battle and such a tremendous victory. Jonathan looks at this young man. He connects with him in his heart, and he realizes he's got a future. And he takes his royal robe off and puts it on him so he won't be embarrassed by how he looks. He gives him his sword, his bow, his belt, his tunic, because David didn't have royal clothes. Jonathan did. Now, Jonathan had more. He went back home, and I'm sure he got all dressed back up in his fine clothes. But this was a powerful statement by the one who should have, by all human rights, become the next king. And he's saying, you know what? I'm going to give this to you. But there's a second reason. I don't think it's coincidence that Jonathan had the faith that he did. Samuel loved Saul. And it stands to reason that he would have also loved Saul's son, Jonathan. And I think there is a huge possibility that Jonathan and Samuel had spent a lot of time together. I know for a fact that Jonathan knew what had been said about his dad, that his dad was not going to be king anymore, that God was going to give somebody else the kingship, and that his family would not continue as king. Jonathan understood this, and you know what? Jonathan was okay with it. And that's a huge, huge thing for Jonathan, because Jonathan would have been the next king. He was the oldest son of the reigning king, and he would have made a fantastic king But Jonathan was so surrendered to God in his heart that when he understood through the teaching of Samuel, or at least minimally by the words of Samuel, that he was not going to be king, he knew somebody else was going to come who was God's choice. And when he saw David walking up with Goliath's head in his hand, and he heard him say how it all came about, Jonathan realized he's the one. Off comes the royal robe onto his shoulders. It was an act of faith on his part. And so that's really an important thing. And I think it brings up another thing, and that is we need to honor those who deserve honor, even if it means honoring them over ourselves. Jonathan is I just love Jonathan. He's one of my favorite people in the Bible. And I see him with a pure heart saying to David, hey, here, I want you to have this. And he puts the royal robe on him and the bow and all these different things. And I think it's important for us to honor those people. And not because it might, we're in a political election year, and we've got all these people that are working with Donald Trump, and they're working with Dr. Carson, and they're working with Marco Rubio and with Ted Cruz, and they're all surrounding them, and they want them to do well. But I dare say that a lot of them want them to do well because if they do well, guess what? I go with them. And their motives are probably pretty much good, but there's some of the, I'm going to ride this thing too, and if he becomes president, I might be his chief of staff. Well, there's none of that with Jonathan, because Jonathan knew that this is a whole different family. He would have no rights. He would have no authority or anything. And so when he takes this robe off and puts it on David's shoulders, it's an amazing surrender of himself to the will of God. Now, here's another thing. When God has chosen you for a task, expect things to fall in place. If God has really chosen you to do something, it's going to all come together. David had been anointed king. Samuel had come, and Samuel had said, you're going to be the next king. Pours the oil on him, and runs down his face. And David, this young kid, he's thinking, okay, I wonder how this is going to happen. I wonder when it's going to happen, And then his dad gets him up the next morning and says, David, go take care of the sheep. But Dad, I was anointed king yesterday. David, you're my son. Go take care of the sheep. David smiles and he goes. And year after year, he just kept, then now he's been brought into the court to play music. At least he's there. But now he's got the head of Goliath, and he's got royal robes on his shoulder. You see, things are falling in place. And it does the same for us. When I look at ministries across the United States today, and I wonder, I think my timer might have just stopped. I'm going to, oh no, it didn't. I've got 7 minutes. That's real good. I look at ministries across the United States, across the world, in fact, and I hear them begging for money. I was always taught something. Here's what I was always taught. God's work done God's way will never lack God's supply. It'll always have, God's work done God's way will always have God's supply. He will provide. I remember it's been long enough ago that Mike probably won't know about it, or Bradley or Craig, but the rest of you might know. But I remember a prominent Christian figure locking himself in a tower and saying that he wasn't going to come out and that God was going to kill him if he didn't raise enough money. You remember that? Okay. Maybe you're older than I think you are. No. Probably not. But, that, to me, that's God's work done God's way never lacks God's supply. God provides. And you don't have to twist and beg and, this radio ministry, this TV ministry, this whatever is going to close if you don't send your money in. How many of you are familiar with the story of George Mueller? Anybody? George Mueller. Oh. Back in 1800. I'm sorry? The orphanage, yes. The guy with the orphanage, yeah. George Mueller believed, and I think this, actually the quote that I gave to you was a Taylor Hudson quote. I might not have got it exactly right, but the essence is from Taylor Hudson. But he was influenced by George Mueller. George Mueller believed that when God wanted you to do something, he'd provide for it. And he started caring for orphans. And I'll never forget one of my favorite stories. When he was just starting with his orphanage, he had 10 or 12 kids, and they're sitting around a table, and he didn't have any food for breakfast. And they sat down, and he bowed his head, and he thanked God for the food they were about to eat. And when he said amen, there was a knock on the door. And when he went to the door, and I might get the order of these wrong, but in very quick succession, a baker came by and said, God woke me up hours ago and told me to bake this bread and to bring it to you. Can you use it? Absolutely, yes, thank you. He sets it on the table. And then the milkman, this was back in the days when they had horse-drawn carriages and they didn't have refrigerated trucks, like we do now. It had broken down, the wagon had broken down in front of the orphanage. And they were going to have to give all the milk away because it would spoil before they could get the repairs done. Could you use some milk? Absolutely, absolutely. And so now they sat back down to eat. God had provided. And it was that way through his entire life. He never told another human being what his needs were. He just told God. And God always provided. And Taylor Hudson, his life was influenced by George Mueller, great missionary to China, another man who also believed that God provides. And so things are going to fall in place. And with David, they did begin to fall in place. And as we think about this fact of David and Jonathan being such difference in age, I think we need to understand we should develop our friendships based on a similar faith and a relationship with God, and not necessarily on age. These guys would have missed one of the greatest friendships of history if they'd have gone by, oh, well, you know what? He's just a young kid. I'm a mature man at 45, hang out with a 15-year-old? What are you talking about? That's beneath me. I mean, after all, I'm the king's son, But they didn't. They sensed that they both had this connection to God and a love for God. And I think that's an important thing. Another thing, we look at verse 5, and now Saul is sending him out. And he's sending him on missions. And it says here, whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. Obedience and faith will result in success. Now, for David, it was very visible success. For us, sometimes it's not so visible. Sometimes we obey. Sometimes we walk with God, and we're doing the right things, and it doesn't work out the way that we think it's going to work out or the way we want it to work out. But obedience and faith still brings success because God sees us. And as he told Samuel way back at the time when he anointed David, he said, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. And it's in the heart where genuine success comes, and it's a result of obedience and of faith. When somebody else gets honored instead of you, choose your response carefully. As they're coming back into town, the women are singing, Saul has killed his thousands. And the women on the other side sang out, yeah, but David killed 10,000. Saul killed his thousands. David killed his tens of thousands. And they're coming into town, and the women are just shouting this back and forth. And Saul is like, what are they saying? They're attributing thousands to me, but tens of thousands to him. It's going to happen in our life. It's going to happen that people are going to be better than we are. We might as well admit it. There's going to be people that are better at anything that you do. There's my timer. That means this time I got to start it and